He thought she didn't belong at his table anymore. Tonight, he was about to learn he had never understood the room at all. The restaurant breathed in low golden light, the kind that softened edges and made everything look more expensive than it already was. Crystal glasses catching reflections like quiet applause, polished marble floors echoing the muted rhythm of leather saws and hushed conversations, and somewhere beyond the closed kitchen doors, the faint, controlled chaos of a world built on precision and fire. Evelyn Carter stepped inside without hesitation, her heels measured, unhurried, as if the space recognized her long before anyone else did. She wore no statement jewelry, no loud colors, just a deep navy dress that traced her silhouette with understated confidence, the kind of elegance that didn't ask for attention but held it anyway. The maitre d' glanced up, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression, recognition, or perhaps respect, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by professional calm. "Good evening," he said, though his tone carried a subtle shift, almost deferential. Evelyn offered a small nod, her gaze drifting across the dining room, scanning not for a seat, but for a memory she had long buried. And then she saw him. Daniel Brooks sat near the center, exactly where he would have chosen, surrounded by the familiar orbit of admiration. Colleagues leaning in, laughter rising just a touch too loud, a woman at his side dressed in curated perfection, her hand resting lightly on his arm like a claim. He hadn't changed in the ways that mattered. The same confident posture, the same calculated smile, the same effortless command of attention. Only now, there was something sharper in his eyes, something that came from believing he had already won. For a brief moment, his gaze lifted, scanning the room out of habit more than intention, and when it landed on Evelyn, time didn't stop, but it shifted. Just enough. Just long enough. Recognition hit first, then surprise, and then, almost immediately, amusement curled at the edges of his mouth. He leaned back slightly, saying something to the table that drew a ripple of laughter, before gesturing, subtle, but unmistakable, toward her. Evelyn felt the weight of those glances before she fully turned. Eyes moved the way they always did in rooms like this, quick and curious, measuring worth in seconds. She walked forward. Anyway, each step steady, each breath controlled, her reflection passing through glass and silver and polished steel, until she stood within reach of the past she had once called her life. "Evelyn," Daniel said, his voice smooth, almost warm, but carrying that familiar edge beneath it, the one that always came right before the cut. "Didn't expect to see you here." The table quieted just enough to listen. He gestured to the empty chair at the edge, not an invitation, but a setup. "Join us," he added, the faintest smirk pulling at his lips. "I mean, if you're still comfortable in places like this." A soft chuckle circled the table, polite, practiced. The woman beside him glanced at Evelyn with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Evelyn didn't sit immediately. She let the silence stretch, not in defiance, but in control, her gaze meeting Daniel's without flinching, without heat, without history. For a second, just one, something in his expression faltered, like a note slightly off-key. Then it was gone. She pulled out the chair and sat, folding her hands lightly in her lap as if she had done this 1,000 times before. Because in a way, she had. Only this time, she wasn't here to prove she belonged. And somewhere behind the closed doors of the kitchen, unseen but already in motion, something, or someone, was preparing to change everything. Daniel leaned back in his chair as if he owned not only the table but the air around it, swirling the last inch of amber liquid in his glass with a casual confidence that had once felt magnetic to her, the kind of presence that filled a room without effort and demanded attention without asking for it. But now, sitting across from him, Evelyn saw something else beneath the polish, something thinner, something rehearsed, like a performance that had gone on just a little too long. "So," he said, his tone light but pointed, "what brings you here, Evelyn?" He did not wait for an answer before adding, "Last I heard, you were keeping things simple." The pause was deliberate, a space filled quickly by the soft laughter of those around him, people who did not know her but felt comfortable enough to judge her, because he had already done it for them. Evelyn glanced at the table, at the carefully arranged plates, the folded linen napkins, the precision of the setting that spoke of a place where nothing was accidental, and then back at Daniel, her expression unchanged. "I like it here," she said simply, her voice calm, steady, unbothered. It was not a defense. It was a statement. The woman beside him tilted her head slightly, studying Evelyn with a polite curiosity that bordered on condescension. "It is not exactly the kind of place you just walk into," she said, her tone sweet but edged, as if offering helpful information. Daniel smirked faintly, tapping the rim of his glass. "Reservations here are booked months in advance," he added. "You have to know someone. Or be someone." The words landed exactly where he intended, precise and quiet, designed to remind her of the version of herself he believed still existed, the one who needed him to belong anywhere that mattered. For a moment, the only sound was the distant clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversations from other tables, a symphony of controlled elegance that continued without interruption, as if nothing significant had happened, as if this small moment of humiliation was just another course being served. Evelyn folded her hands gently over the edge of the table, her fingers relaxed, her posture effortless, and met his gaze without hesitation. "I did not have trouble getting a table," she said. No emphasis, no challenge, just quiet certainty. Something flickered again in Daniel's eyes, quick and almost imperceptible, but it was there, a brief disruption in the rhythm he had set. He covered it quickly with a soft chuckle, leaning forward slightly. "Of course you did not," he said, though the words did not quite land the same way this time. A server approached then, placing a new set of menus before them, the thick paper embossed with subtle gold lettering, each movement precise, respectful, practiced, but when he set one in front of Evelyn, there was a difference, a fraction of a second longer, a glance that lingered just enough to suggest recognition again, not as a guest, but as something more. Evelyn noticed. Daniel did not. "You should try the tasting menu," Daniel continued, flipping his menu open without really reading it, speaking more for the table than for her. "It is complicated, though. A lot of components. Not exactly beginner-friendly." Another ripple of amusement circled the table, softer this time, less certain. Evelyn picked up the menu, her eyes scanning the items briefly, but there was no confusion in her expression, no hesitation. If anything, there was familiarity, the kind that did not need to be explained. Somewhere behind the walls, a door opened and closed, a faint shift in the energy of the room, subtle but real, like a current changing direction. And for the first time since she sat down, Evelyn allowed herself the smallest breath, not of tension, but of timing. Because this was not about proving him wrong. It was about letting him reveal just how little he understood before everything changed. The menu felt familiar in her hands, not because she had memorized the words, but because she understood the language beneath them, the balance of flavors, the intention behind each pairing, the quiet confidence of a kitchen that did not need to prove itself. And as Evelyn traced a line down the page, her expression remained composed, almost detached, while across from her Daniel watched with a faint smile that had once meant affection but now carried something sharper, something performative. "Careful," he said lightly, resting his elbow against the table. "Some of those dishes are acquired tastes." The woman beside him let out a soft laugh, lifting her glass slightly. "It is very refined," she added, as though translating for someone who would not understand. Evelyn did not look up immediately. She turned one page, then another, her movements unhurried, precise, as if time itself had slowed around her while the rest of the table waited for a reaction that never came. "I will have the tasting menu," she said at last, closing the menu gently and placing it beside her plate. No hesitation, no question, just a decision. The server, who had been standing a respectful distance away, stepped forward, and this time, the difference was unmistakable. His posture shifted subtly, straighter, more attentive, and when he spoke, his tone carried a note of quiet acknowledgement. "Of course," he said, inclining his head slightly. "Would you prefer the chef's progression as designed, or would you like any adjustments?" It was a question not typically offered, not in this way, not with this level of deference. Daniel's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before he recovered, letting out a short, amused breath. "She will take it as it comes," he interjected smoothly, as if reclaiming control of the moment. No need to complicate things. The server did not move. His attention remained on Evelyn. The silence stretched, thin and deliberate, and for the first time, Daniel was not the one directing it. Evelyn lifted her gaze, meeting the server's eyes with a calm certainty that needed no explanation. As designed, she said. A simple answer. But it landed differently. The server nodded once, respectfully, before stepping back, and as he turned, there was the faintest hint of something unspoken, something that lingered in the air like a note held just a second longer than expected. Around the table, the energy shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a current beginning to change direction. Daniel tapped his fingers lightly against the stem of his glass, a small, unconscious movement that betrayed a flicker of irritation beneath his composed exterior. "You have been practicing," he said, his tone still light, but edged now with curiosity he did not intend to show. That sounded almost convincing. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She reached for her water, lifting the glass with steady hands, taking a small sip before setting it down with the same quiet precision that had defined every movement she had made since sitting down. "It is not difficult," she said, her voice even. "Once you understand what you are looking at." The words were simple, but they did not belong to the woman he remembered, and Daniel felt it, even if he could not yet name it. Around them, plates arrived at neighboring tables, each dish presented with careful explanation, each movement part of a choreography that had been perfected over years, and somewhere beyond the visible, behind the closed doors and polished surfaces, something was building, something that did not announce itself loudly, but moved with intention, step by step, toward a moment that could not be undone. Evelyn sat still within it, not waiting, not anticipating, but simply allowing it to unfold, because unlike before, she did not need to fight for space in this world. She already knew exactly where she stood, and Daniel, for the first time since she walked in, was no longer entirely sure. The first course arrived without announcement, placed before Evelyn with a quiet precision that felt almost ceremonial, a delicate arrangement of color and texture that seemed less like food and more like intention made visible, each element positioned with purpose, each detail controlled, and for a brief moment, the table fell silent, not out of respect for her, but for the presentation itself, the kind of silence that expensive places commanded without asking. Daniel glanced at the plate, then at Evelyn, a faint curve returning to his lips as if the moment had reset in his favor. "Well," he said lightly, leaning back again, "let us see how you handle that." There was amusement in his tone, but also expectation, the same expectation he had always carried, that she would hesitate, that she would reveal the gap between where she was and where he believed she belonged. The woman beside him watched with open curiosity now, her earlier confidence softening into something more observant, as though she sensed a shift but could not yet define it. Evelyn did not reach for her fork immediately. She studied the plate for a second longer, not as someone unsure, but as someone recognizing, understanding the composition the way one recognizes a familiar melody played in a new arrangement. Then, with a calm that did not need to announce itself, she picked up her fork and knife, her movements fluid, precise, unhurried, and took her first bite. She did not react instantly. She let the flavors settle, her expression thoughtful, almost analytical, and then, quietly, she nodded once, more to herself than to anyone else. "They adjusted the acidity," she said, her voice even, as if commenting on something obvious. "It is cleaner now." The words slipped into the air with no effort, but they did not belong in the role Daniel had assigned her, and for the first time, the amusement on his face did not return as easily. "Adjusted?" he repeated, a hint of skepticism threading through his tone. Evelyn set her utensils down gently, her gaze drifting briefly toward the far side of the room, toward the invisible boundary where the dining area ended and the kitchen began. The previous version leaned heavier. She continued, not looking at him, not performing for him, simply stating what she knew. This one is more restrained. It lets the main ingredient speak. The table grew quieter, not out of politeness, but out of uncertainty, the kind that follows when something does not fit the expected pattern. Daniel let out a short breath, half laugh, half dismissal, though it came a fraction too late. "You sound like you have been watching too many cooking shows," he said, but there was a tightness now, subtle but real, in the way he held his glass. Evelyn did not respond. She returned her attention to the plate, taking another bite with the same composed rhythm, as if the conversation no longer required her participation. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet performance, servers moving in measured paths, dishes arriving and leaving with seamless coordination. But at their table, something had shifted, something small but undeniable, like the first crack in a surface that had once seemed solid. A second server approached then, carrying wine, and as he poured into Evelyn's glass, his hand was steady, but his eyes lifted for just a second, meeting hers with a recognition that was no longer subtle. "The pairing complements the balance," he said softly, his tone carrying a note that was not part of the standard script. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, acknowledging understanding. Daniel watched the exchange, his gaze narrowing just enough to reveal the question forming beneath his composure, a question he was not yet ready to ask. Because the room had not changed. The table had not changed. But the way it responded to her had. And that was something he could not ignore much longer. The second course arrived with a quiet elegance that seemed to carry more weight than the first, a deeper composition, richer tones, the kind of dish that did not try to impress at first glance, but revealed itself slowly, layer by layer. And as it was placed in front of Evelyn, the server's posture again shifted in that almost imperceptible way, as though he was not merely serving a guest, but presenting something to someone who understood what it meant. Daniel noticed it this time. Not fully, not clearly, but enough for a faint crease to form between his brows before he smoothed it away with another practiced smile. "They are really taking care of you tonight," he said, his tone light, but edged with something tighter beneath, something that did not quite belong to confidence anymore. Evelyn glanced at the plate, then lifted her eyes briefly toward him, her expression unchanged, steady, unbothered. "They always do," she replied softly. The words were simple, but they did not sound like a guess or a hope. They sounded like a fact. A pause followed, subtle but heavier than before, as if the air itself needed a moment to adjust. The woman beside Daniel shifted slightly in her seat, her earlier composure now tinged with curiosity that she could no longer hide. "Have you been here often?" she asked, her tone gentler now, less dismissive, more careful. Evelyn considered the question for a second, not because she needed to think, but because she understood what it was really asking. Not about frequency, but about belonging. "Enough," she said. No elaboration. No explanation. Just enough to leave space for interpretation. And that space began to work against Daniel in a way he had not anticipated. He reached for his glass again, taking a slow sip, his eyes never fully leaving her now, as if he was trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the version he had filed away years ago, the one who hesitated, who deferred, who needed his approval to feel anchored in rooms like this. But that version was not here, and the difference was beginning to unsettle him. Evelyn picked up her fork again, tasting the second course with the same measured attention, her movements effortless, as though she was not adapting to the environment, but moving within something already familiar. She did not comment immediately this time. She simply ate, quietly, confidently, allowing the silence to stretch again, but now it no longer belonged to Daniel. It belonged to her. Around them, the restaurant continued its steady rhythm, but there were small changes now, subtle shifts in how the staff moved near their table, a fraction slower, a fraction more attentive, as if an invisible line had been drawn and everyone on the other side of it understood something that the people at the table did not. A man in a tailored suit crossed the far side of the room, pausing briefly near the entrance to the kitchen, his gaze scanning the dining area before settling, just for a moment, on Evelyn. He gave the slightest nod, almost unnoticeable, before disappearing behind the door. Daniel followed the movement instinctively, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place what he had just seen, but the moment passed too quickly, leaving only a lingering sense that something was happening just outside his understanding. "You seem comfortable," he said finally, the word carrying a different weight. Now, no longer an insult, but a question he did not know how to ask directly. Evelyn set her fork down gently, lifting her gaze to meet his again, her eyes calm, steady, reflecting none of the tension beginning to surface across the table. "I am," she said. No defense, no pride, just truth. And for the first time since she sat down, Daniel did not immediately respond. Because comfort, in a place like this, was not something you could pretend. It was something you either had or you did not. And the longer he watched her, the harder it became to believe that she was pretending at all. Daniel had always believed he understood rooms like this, believed he could read them the way other people read headlines, quickly, confidently, without second-guessing. But now, as the third course approached, and the quiet choreography of the restaurant continued around them, something felt just slightly out of rhythm, not enough to alarm, but enough to unsettle. The server who carried the next dish did not introduce it immediately. Instead, he paused beside Evelyn, just for a fraction longer than necessary, his posture composed but attentive in a way that no longer felt accidental. "The next course," he said, his voice softer, more deliberate, "is one of the chef's signatures." There was a subtle emphasis on the last word, something that lingered just beneath the surface of the sentence. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, her expression calm, but her eyes held a quiet acknowledgement that did not go unnoticed this time. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around his glass before he set it down, his gaze shifting between Evelyn and the server as if trying to catch something unspoken passing between them. "Signature," he repeated, a faint smile returning, though it felt thinner now, less certain. "Sounds important." The server did not respond to him. His attention remained, unmistakably, on Evelyn. The plate was set before her with careful precision, the arrangement intricate but balanced, a composition that spoke of restraint and control rather than excess. Evelyn looked at it for a moment, her gaze steady, her breathing even, and for the first time since the evening began, something almost imperceptible softened in her expression, not surprise, not awe, but recognition that carried something deeper, something personal. She reached for her fork, her movements as fluid as ever, and took a bite. Without hesitation. The reaction was subtle, but it was there, a slight pause, a quiet stillness that lasted just long enough to be noticed before she continued, her composure returning seamlessly. "He refined the texture," she said softly, almost to herself, though the words carried clearly across the table. "It is more balanced now." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was no longer casual. It was attentive. The woman beside Daniel lowered her glass slightly, her curiosity now fully engaged, her earlier assumptions dissolving into something more cautious. "You speak like you know the chef," she said, her tone no longer edged, but searching. Evelyn did not answer right away. She set her fork down gently, her fingers resting lightly against the table as she considered the question, not because she lacked an answer, but because she understood the weight of it. "I know his work," she said finally. It was enough. And somehow, it was more than enough. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his earlier ease replaced by something sharper, more focused, as if he was finally beginning to recognize that the narrative he had been following was no longer in his control. "And how exactly would you know that?" he asked, his voice still calm, but carrying a note of insistence he could not fully conceal. Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes steady, unflinching, reflecting none of the tension building in his. "The same way anyone does," she replied. "By paying attention." It was a simple answer, but it did not satisfy him. Not anymore, because the room itself was no longer supporting his version of reality. Across the dining area, the man in the tailored suit had returned, standing now near the entrance to the kitchen once more, his posture straight, his attention fixed on something beyond the immediate scene. A quiet exchange passed between him and another member of the staff, too subtle to hear, but deliberate enough to notice. Daniel followed the movement again, his unease growing, not because he understood what was happening, but because he did not. And at the center of it all, Evelyn remained exactly as she had been since she arrived, calm, composed, entirely at ease, as if she had never stepped into unfamiliar territory at all, but had simply returned to a place that had been waiting for her all along. The fourth course did not arrive immediately, and for the first time that evening, the delay felt intentional, not a disruption, but a pause that carried meaning, like a breath drawn before something significant unfolded, and Daniel felt it before he understood it, his gaze shifting more frequently now, not just to Evelyn, but to the room itself, to the staff, to the subtle movements that seemed to orbit around her in ways he could no longer dismiss as coincidence. "Service is slowing down," he remarked, attempting to reclaim control of the narrative, though his voice lacked the effortless ease it had carried earlier. That usually means they are trying too hard. The comment landed flat, unanswered, because no one at the table seemed entirely convinced anymore, not even him. Evelyn remained still, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her presence unchanged, as if the passing time did not affect her at all. She was not waiting. She was allowing. A quiet shift occurred near the kitchen entrance, subtle but deliberate, as the man in the tailored suit stepped forward, speaking briefly with a server before turning his attention fully toward the dining room, his gaze settling again, unmistakably, on Evelyn. This time, he did not look away quickly. He held the look just long enough for it to be seen, just long enough for it to mean something. Daniel noticed. He could not ignore it now. "Do you know him?" he asked suddenly, his tone sharper than before, cutting through the quiet tension that had settled over the table. Evelyn followed his gaze for a moment, her eyes landing on the man near the kitchen, and then she looked back at Daniel, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "He knows his job," she said. Not an answer, not a denial. Something else. Something that made the question feel smaller than it had been a second ago. Daniel leaned back slightly, studying her now with a focus that bordered on unease, as if he was trying to peel back layers that no longer revealed what he expected to find. "You have changed," he said, quieter now, less performative, more real than anything he had said that evening. Evelyn did not smile. She did not soften. She simply met his gaze with the same calm certainty that had defined her from the moment she walked in. "No," she replied. "I stopped trying to be who you needed me to be." The words did not rise. They did not strike. They settled. And somehow, that made them heavier. The table fell silent again, but this time, it was not about food, or presentation, or subtle tension. It was about truth, spoken without effort, without defense, without the need to convince anyone. Daniel's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough, the edges of his confidence no longer holding as firmly as they had before. The woman beside him looked between them, her earlier certainty replaced by something more cautious, more aware that she had stepped into a dynamic she did not fully understand. Then, as if responding to something unseen, the doors to the kitchen opened. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that drew attention without demanding it. A figure emerged, not rushed, not announced, but unmistakable in presence, the kind of presence that did not need introduction because the room itself adjusted around it. Conversation softened. Movement slowed. Even the air seemed to shift. Daniel turned instinctively, his gaze following the subtle change, and for a moment, he forgot about Evelyn entirely, because something else had entered the room, something that did not belong to him. And for the first time that night, he was no longer the one in control of what came next. The figure moved through the dining room without urgency, yet everything around him seemed to adjust in quiet response. Servers shifting their paths, conversations lowering just a fraction, the subtle gravity of someone whose presence did not need to be announced because it was already understood. He was not dressed to impress in the obvious way, no extravagant display, just a tailored black jacket, sleeves rolled once at the wrist, the simplicity of it somehow more commanding than anything louder could have been. Daniel watched him approach with a tightening focus, his earlier confidence now replaced by something sharper, something closer to calculation, as if he was trying to place the man within a hierarchy he understood, a category that would make sense of the shift he felt in the room. But the man did not move like someone seeking recognition. He moved like someone who owned the space without needing to claim it. Evelyn did not turn immediately. She did not need to. The moment had already arrived for her long before it reached the table. She remained still, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly where they had been, her calm now carrying a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with the people around her and everything to do with what was about to unfold. The man stopped beside the table, not at Daniel's side, not at the center where attention had been focused all evening, but directly beside Evelyn. The positioning alone was enough to disrupt everything Daniel thought he understood. "Evelyn," the man said, his voice low, steady, carrying a warmth that did not need to perform itself. It was not loud, but it cut through the space with effortless clarity. Evelyn lifted her gaze then, meeting his with a softness that had not appeared once since she sat down, not because she needed to change, but because she no longer had to hold anything back. "You are late," she said quietly, though there was no accusation in her tone, only familiarity, the kind that comes from knowing someone beyond what is visible. A faint smile touched his expression, subtle, controlled. Only by a few minutes, he replied. The kitchen insisted on perfection. The words were simple, but they carried meaning that extended beyond the surface. And around the table, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was stunned. Daniel's gaze moved between them, his mind working quickly, trying to connect the pieces, trying to reclaim control of a situation that had already moved beyond him. "And you are?" he asked, the question sharper now, no longer casual, no longer polite, but edged with the need to re-establish footing. The man turned his attention to him then, not dismissive, not confrontational, just calm, as if the question itself did not hold the weight Daniel intended. "Alexander Laurent," he said. The name landed softly, but its effect was immediate. Recognition did not come all at once. It moved through the table in waves, first confusion, then realization, then something closer to disbelief. The woman beside Daniel straightened slightly, her earlier composure replaced by a sudden awareness of the shift in status she could not ignore. Daniel's expression did not change dramatically, but something beneath it did, something that tightened, something that no longer fit the version of the evening he had constructed. Alexander did not elaborate. He did not need to. Instead, he reached down, his hand resting lightly against the back of Evelyn's chair, a gesture simple in action but unmistakable in meaning. "I hope they have been taking care of you," he said, his attention returning fully to her. Evelyn's gaze held his for a moment, steady, calm, grounded in something deeper than the tension surrounding them. "They always do," she replied. And this time, no one at the table laughed, because the meaning of those words had finally changed. The name lingered in the air longer than it should have, as if the room itself needed a moment to absorb it, and Daniel felt it before he fully understood it. The subtle shift from uncertainty to recognition moving through the table in quiet waves, the kind that did not announce themselves, but changed everything nonetheless. Alexander Laurent. It was not just a name. It was a reputation, a presence that existed far beyond this room, woven into the very identity of places like this, into the standards people like Daniel admired but had never truly touched. Daniel's posture straightened slightly, an instinctive reaction, as if his body recognized the hierarchy his mind was still catching up to. "Laurent," he repeated, slower now, his voice measured, searching for footing. As in, he did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. Alexander met his gaze calmly, offering no correction, no elaboration, just a quiet acknowledgement that confirmed more than words would have. The silence that followed was heavier than any before it, no longer uncertain, no longer curious, but definitive. The woman beside Daniel shifted again, her earlier composure replaced entirely now by awareness, her attention moving between Evelyn and Alexander with a clarity she could no longer hide. Evelyn remained exactly as she had been, her presence unchanged, as if the reveal had not altered her position because she had never been out of place to begin with. Alexander's hand rested lightly against the back of her chair for a moment longer before he let it fall naturally to his side, his focus still centered on her, not the table, not the reactions forming around them. "I heard you were here," he said, his tone quiet, conversational, as though the setting did not matter, as though the tension surrounding them did not exist. "I wanted to make sure everything was exactly as it should be." Evelyn held his gaze, her expression softening just slightly again, not in weakness, but in familiarity, the kind that came from being seen without needing to explain anything. "It is," she said. "They have not missed a detail." The exchange was simple, but it carried a weight that the others at the table could feel without fully understanding, a language built on something deeper than status or performance. Daniel watched it unfold, his earlier confidence now replaced by something far more complicated, something that edged closer to realization with every passing second. "So you own this place," he said finally, the words coming out more bluntly than he intended, an attempt to reduce what was happening into something he could categorize, something he could control. Alexander turned his attention to him again, his expression unchanged, composed, unbothered. "I am responsible for it," he replied. It was not a denial. It was not a confirmation in the way Daniel expected. It was something else, something that placed him beyond the need to define his role in simple terms. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back again. But the movement no longer carried the same ease, his mind working to reassemble the narrative he had been so certain of just minutes ago. His gaze shifted to Evelyn once more, studying her now not with dismissal, but with a dawning awareness that he had been looking at her through a lens that no longer applied. "You knew," he said, quieter now, less accusation, more realization. Evelyn did not look away. She did not deny it. She did not confirm it in any dramatic way. "I did not hide," she replied. And that was the truth. Not a reveal, not a defense, just a fact that landed with more force than anything else she could have said. Because the difference was not in what she had become. It was in what he had failed to see. And as Daniel sat there, surrounded by the same room, the same table, the same people, it was no longer Evelyn who seemed out of place. It was him. Daniel had spent years believing that power revealed itself loudly, in titles, in numbers, in the way people leaned in when he spoke. But now, sitting across from Evelyn with Alexander Laurent standing quietly beside her, he realized how wrong that understanding had been, because the kind of power in front of him did not announce itself. It rearranged the room without asking permission. He straightened his jacket slightly, a small, controlled movement, as if trying to recover a version of himself that no longer quite fit the moment. "Well," he said, forcing a measured tone, "that explains a lot." But it did not. Not really. Because what unsettled him was not who Alexander was. It was what that meant about Evelyn. Alexander's attention remained on her, not dismissing Daniel, but not prioritizing him either, as if the hierarchy Daniel relied on simply did not apply here. "Have you finished your courses?" Alexander asked, his voice calm, grounded, the question carrying the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly how the evening should unfold. Evelyn glanced briefly at the plate in front of her, then back at him. "Almost," she said. They adjusted a few things. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Alexander's expression, the kind that came not from surprise, but from recognition. "I thought they might," he replied. "You always notice." The words were simple, but they carried a history Daniel could not access, a shared understanding that did not include him, and that realization settled heavier than anything that had been said so far. Around the table, no one spoke. The woman beside Daniel had gone completely still now, her earlier confidence replaced by something closer to caution, as if she understood instinctively that whatever dynamic she had stepped into, she was no longer part of it. Daniel cleared his throat slightly, trying again to regain ground. "So," he said, looking between them, "this is your husband?" The word felt awkward coming from him, less like a question and more like a test he was not sure he wanted answered. Evelyn met his gaze, her expression steady, unchanged. "Yes," she said. No elaboration, no emphasis, just truth. And this time, there was no space left to reinterpret it. Alexander did not add anything to the statement. He did not need to confirm it. His presence alone had already done that. Instead, he shifted his attention briefly toward the dining room, his eyes scanning the space with quiet precision, before returning to Evelyn. "There is one course left," he said. "I would like you to have it as it was meant to be." The phrasing was deliberate, and though the words were directed at her, they carried a weight that extended beyond the plate in front of her. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly. "I would like that," she replied. The exchange was quiet, controlled, but it moved the evening forward in a way that no one else at the table could influence anymore. Daniel felt it. The shift from a situation he had been orchestrating to one he no longer had any authority over, and for the first time, he did not interrupt. He did not joke. He did not attempt to diminish what was happening. He simply watched, because something in him understood, even if he could not fully articulate it yet, that the version of Evelyn he had dismissed no longer existed in any way he could control. And as the staff began to move again, subtly repositioning, preparing for what came next, Daniel realized that the dinner he thought he was leading had never belonged to him at all. It had been hers from the moment she walked in. He just had not known it. The final course did not arrive with the quiet anonymity of the others, and even before it appeared, the room seemed to anticipate it, a subtle shift rippling outward from the kitchen as if something unseen had been set into motion with deliberate care, and Daniel felt it again, that same unfamiliar sensation of being outside the center of something he could not control. This time, the doors opened wider, not abruptly, but with intention, and the staff moved with a coordination that was no longer just service, but presentation, their paths aligning, their timing precise, creating a moment that drew the room's attention without ever demanding it. Alexander remained beside Evelyn, his presence steady, grounded, as if this was not a performance, but a continuation of something already understood between them. A single plate was carried forward first, not to the table, but placed briefly at a station nearby, where the man in the tailored suit oversaw it with a quiet nod before stepping back, his role complete. Then, the server approached, slower now, more deliberate, and when the dish was finally set in front of Evelyn, it felt less like the end of a meal and more like the culmination of something carefully constructed. The plate itself was simple at first glance, but every element held intention, every detail precise, restrained, confident in a way that did not need excess. To prove its worth, Evelyn looked at it, and this time, she did not reach for her fork immediately. She let the moment settle, her gaze tracing the composition with a familiarity that no one at the table could mistake anymore. "This was not on the menu," Daniel said, his voice quieter now, not challenging, but trying to understand, trying to anchor himself to something concrete. Alexander did not look at him. "It was not meant to be," he replied calmly. His attention remained on Evelyn, but it was always part of the evening. The words carried a weight that extended beyond the dish itself, and for the first time, Daniel did not attempt to interrupt, because he understood, at least in part, that this moment did not belong to him. Evelyn finally reached for her fork, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if she was not just tasting the dish, but acknowledging everything that had led to it. She took a bite, and for the first time that evening, her composure shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but enough, a quiet stillness settling over her, something deeper than analysis, something closer to recognition. She did not speak right away. She did not need to. Alexander watched her, not for approval, not for validation, but with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew what the moment meant. "You kept the balance," she said finally, her voice softer now, but steady, grounded in something real. "But you changed the structure." Alexander inclined his head slightly, a faint acknowledgement passing between them. "It needed to evolve," he said. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod, not as a guest responding to a chef, but as someone who understood the intention behind the creation. Around them, the table remained silent, not out of politeness, but because there was nothing left to say that would not feel out of place. Daniel sat back, his earlier posture gone, replaced by something quieter, something more reflective, as he watched a moment unfold that he had not been invited into. And for the first time, he did not try to reclaim it. Because the truth had already settled in, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that left no room for interpretation. He had spent the evening trying to place Evelyn back into a version of her that no longer existed, trying to measure her against a past that had no power here. And now, sitting in a room that responded to her without question, watching a man who did not need to prove anything stand beside her with quiet certainty, Daniel understood something he had not been prepared to face. She had not returned to prove anything to him. She had simply outgrown the world where his opinion mattered at all. The room did not erupt, did not applaud, did not react in any obvious way, and yet everything had already shifted so completely that silence itself felt like acknowledgement, a quiet agreement among strangers that something definitive had just taken place, something that required no commentary because it spoke for itself. Evelyn set her fork down gently after the final bite, her movements unhurried, composed, as though the evening had unfolded exactly as it was meant to, no more, no less. She did not look around the table immediately, did not seek reactions or confirmation, because she did not need them. Her gaze lifted instead to Alexander, and in that moment, the entire weight of the evening seemed to narrow into something simple, something steady, something that belonged only to them. "It is perfect," she said softly. "Not praise, not surprise, just recognition." Alexander inclined his head slightly, his expression calm, grounded, as if the outcome had never been in question. "It always was," he replied. The exchange was quiet, almost private, yet it carried across the table with a clarity that made everything else feel distant. Daniel sat still, his hands resting near his glass, but no longer holding it, his posture no longer projecting anything at all, because there was nothing left to project. The version of the evening he had constructed had dissolved piece by piece, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through something far more unsettling, something he could not interrupt or control. He looked at Evelyn again, really looked at her this time, not through the memory of who she had been, not through the assumptions he had carried, but as she was now, sitting calmly in a space that responded to her without question, beside a man who did not need to assert his place because it was already understood. "I did not know," he said finally, his voice quieter than it had been. All evening, stripped of the edge, the performance, the certainty. It was not an apology. It was not even a question. It was simply an admission of something he could no longer deny. Evelyn met his gaze, her expression steady, not cold, not warm, just clear. "You did not look," she replied. The words settled between them, not harsh, not accusatory, but precise in a way that left no room for argument. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly, but the movement carried none of the confidence it once had, only a quiet acceptance of something he had not expected to face. Around them, the restaurant continued as it always had, the rhythm unbroken, the atmosphere unchanged, but for Daniel, the room was no longer what it had been when he walked in. It had become something else entirely, something that no longer revolved around him. The woman beside him glanced down at her plate, then back at Evelyn, her earlier certainty replaced by something closer to respect, or perhaps understanding, though she did not speak it aloud. Alexander stepped back slightly then, not leaving, but giving the space a natural shift, as if the moment had reached its conclusion without needing to be extended. Evelyn rose from her seat, her movement smooth, unhurried, and for a brief second, the table seemed to pause with her, as if acknowledging the quiet finality of it all. She did not address Daniel again. She did not need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken, not in words, but in presence, in silence, in the way the world around her had responded without hesitation. And as she stood there, composed, self-possessed, entirely at ease, it became clear that this had never been about proving anything. It had only ever been about becoming someone who no longer needed to. The night did not end with a scene, and that was the part Daniel would remember most. Not the moment Alexander spoke, not the quiet shift of the room, but the absence of anything dramatic, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to reclaim. Evelyn stood beside the table for only a second longer, long enough for the silence to settle into something permanent, something that no longer belonged to the tension of the evening, but to its resolution. She reached for her clutch with a simple, fluid motion, the kind that suggested she had done this 1,000 times, not as someone trying to belong, but as someone who already did. Alexander stepped beside her, not leading, not following, but aligned, his presence steady, effortless, as if their movement together required no coordination at all. No one stopped them. No one questioned them. The staff adjusted instinctively, creating a path without being asked, the same quiet deference that had followed Evelyn from the moment she entered now guiding her out. Daniel watched them go, his gaze fixed, not out of anger, not even out of regret, but out of something far more unsettling, clarity. The version of the story he had believed in, the one where he defined the ending, had never existed outside his own assumptions. He had mistaken familiarity for understanding, control for significance, and now, sitting in a room that continued without him, he saw the difference. The woman beside him shifted slightly, as if about to speak, but stopped, her attention lingering on Evelyn's retreating figure instead, her expression no longer dismissive, no longer curious, but quiet, almost contemplative. Around them, the restaurant resumed its natural rhythm, conversations rising again, glasses lifting, the low hum of a world that did not pause for any single moment, no matter how significant it felt to those within it. But for Daniel, the sound felt distant now, as if he were no longer part of it in the same way. He reached for his glass again, then stopped, his hand hovering for a second before resting back against the table. There was nothing left to anchor himself to, no narrative he could reshape, No final remark that would restore the balance he had lost. Evelyn did not look back as she walked toward the exit, her steps measured, calm, unchanged, because she had not come for closure, and she did not need it. The past had already released its hold on her long before this night began. As the doors opened and the cool air of the evening slipped briefly into the warm, controlled space behind her, she stepped through without hesitation, the transition seamless, like moving from one world into another that had always been hers. Alexander followed beside her, and for a moment, as the doors closed again, the only trace of their presence was the quiet shift they left behind, something intangible but undeniable. Daniel sat there a moment longer, the silence now entirely his, no longer shared, no longer shaped by anyone else. He exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering to the table, to the untouched edges of the evening that had not unfolded the way he expected. And in that stillness, the truth settled fully, not with force, not with drama, but with quiet certainty. He had not lost her tonight. He had lost her long ago. He had simply been the last to understand it. And somewhere beyond the walls of the restaurant, beyond the reach of his voice or his memory, Evelyn Carter continued forward, not as someone who had returned to prove anything, but as someone who had already become everything he once believed she never could be.